Lately, all I seems to see is lots of ladies and gentrified peoples making biddings for dwellings in the roofings of former church steeples. And I'm spying loads of lads and loads of lasses, traditional working classes, turfed out on their asses. Oh my, what a state of chassis. Check out the Dublin 70 Heavenly O'Devanly flats, clinging to the hem of the skirt of the stony bats. Proper prime land for top dog property cats, hitting their targets with air stolen gats. Bang on the ear, kicked out to the curb. I've a contract here and blocks to refurb. Shift it, I've been granted planning permission for that space, quoting the omnipotent road and rigging up the rat race, fixing it so the middle ground is squeezed. Miss a few payments and the family gaff gets seized, and you're homeless in a hotel, you're kipping in a car. I know the signs so well, 'tis gentrified we are.
I thought that we were going out onto the streets one night, we were going to do a soup run or, feed the homeless, and I suppose 5 years later it was a case of not being able to come off the streets. There was such a demand for the service that we provide now. Over the time it's just moved into so many different areas. There's a different demographic of people that are homeless now, particularly over the last 2 years. We've moved a hell of a lot more away from the rough sleeper element into an element of family homelessness, and that would be the majority of people that we would deal with now would be young children and families. We see the homelessness has changed. It's changed dramatically. We're seeing people that are sleeping in rough and garden stations that were painters and decorators a couple of years ago. We have a housing crisis. There's a serious situation. Year on year we're going to see more and more people fall into homelessness, and we're top heavy now at the moment. We've too many homeless people and too many people that are on social housing wait lists, and we haven't got enough supply coming through in order to house those people.
We pride ourselves on having a safety net, a social welfare safety net, and the idea that people will have that in terms of not just money, but in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of health. I think you've seen that safety net, that social safety net, just destroyed. Because the redistributed wealth has become so wide between the richest and the poorest, that has destroyed that social inclusion model. Now, we don't have social housing, so suddenly the private market can exploit that. In education, people can get around the whole idea of having an equal education because now you get private education. Same in health. And so what happens is, as more people leave the health services because they can get it privately, or leave the education service because they can get it privately, that leads to a disintegration of those services. And it's the same with housing. Because there isn't enough housing, the rents are shooting up, people are losing their homes, and then social housing, there's no social housing, so families are becoming under huge pressure, so people are leaving the family home, becoming homeless, and ending up in homelessness, and it's economic reasons.
There's clearly a situation where there are perhaps 30,000, perhaps 70,000 houses which are underwater, and you might say the difficulty that we're currently experiencing in homelessness is going to be massively increased if these people are actually evicted. It's madness to be selling the properties for next to nothing, for buttons if you like, to foreign investment funds. The right to personal integrity and the right to accommodation and shelter, these are fundamental rights. They pertain to the dignity of man. The impact on a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old of being in a hotel bedroom for a long time is lifelong.
What we do see, and because it's visual, is the rough sleeper. But nobody sits down and asks them, how did you survive this? How do you get through a night? How do you manage to clean yourself? How do you manage to feed yourself? The questions that we always ask ourselves is, why did he end up there? Must have been drugs, must be mental health, he must have been through prison. And we shouldn't be dividing society by that. We should be looking and saying and helping that vulnerable person. We don't know what happened in his story or her story. We shouldn't have to ask what their story is. They don't see somebody losing their home through bank repossession. They don't see how then they must find a property or a family member to stay with, so that becomes an overcrowded property. They don't see how difficult it is then to private rent in the private market, or if you're eligible for social housing support through HAP, how hard it is to find that landlord. A family won't go to emergency accommodation unless they've tried all these other ways of not going through the system.
So the stairwells were open, and I can remember as a child coming down in the morning, and my mother would sometimes give me a cup of tea or a cut of bread to give to the poor misfortunates who were sheltering overnight. in the tenements of Dublin in the 1950s and 60s. Even though there was very little to share, there was a lot of sharing, and there was a lot of, there was a lot of generosity from the heart, which is not to romanticize poverty in any way. People who have very little are often the most generous in our societies. But I think that nowadays, the big difference from my childhood is there's an attempt to normalise that, to say that this is a certain amount is acceptable, and really it was never acceptable. And it's never going to be acceptable that families are left homeless in a relatively wealthy community. Because by global standards, believe me, Ireland is a wealthy country, and there's no excuse. I mean, the 50s and even earlier, my grandparents' lifetime, you could say we were a young state, and yet we made more of an effort. There was more public consciousness of the deprivation of not having a home. And it's completely frustrating that in this day and age that people have nowhere to lay their heads, and that children are being raised in situations where they're going to carry that trauma for the rest of their lives.
What happened with the Bolt Hostel and Apollo House was that there were two abandoned buildings. One was owned by DCC, that was the Bolt, and the other was owned by NAMA. We felt that there was an injustice because this was the people's property, and that it should be opened up to help the homeless who have been trying to access the services through the state, and to try and give them a human element of how services should be. It wasn't about their addiction or their mental health, it was actually just sharing and giving a bit of love, and it was actually showing the vulnerable that they are accepted. Just because they're down on their luck and they can't access the services, that it's not their fault. So the whole idea around it was to bring everyone together that wanted to give this love to anybody that was vulnerable. And there's no way Apollo House would have worked if everybody didn't come together. And that sense of coming together really empowered everybody. It didn't matter who you were, who you worked for, different walks of life came into Apollo House just to help. So it was a real kind, caring, compassionate atmosphere of love. And you wouldn't really believe that unless you were in there. Before Apollo House, I would have said no. I didn't really think that society could have came together the way they did. After Apollo House, I believe that the power is in society and that people can bring about change and love. It's just that they need to take action. It's not only is it the vulnerable in society's problem, it will be your children's problem, it will be our grandchildren's problem, and nothing's going to change unless we ourselves mobilise and organise.
We've over 100,000 people that are on social housing waiting lists. We talk about the 10,000 that are homeless, but we need to factor in all these other people that are actually, either sofa-suffering, living in overcrowded housing. It's become socially acceptable, in my opinion, for, families to be held up in hotels for months on end in one bedroom and not having any facilities such as cookers and washing machines and, the normal everyday things that we would take, for granted. And the system is failing. Many people want to help and want to change and want to do something. Whether they have an outlet to do that or not. Our outlet was to come out 5 years ago and start handing out soup and sandwiches. Unless the Minister is going to come out and actually directly build through the councils 10,000 social housing units every year, we're going to continue to have the problem that we do, and it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Things that create homelessness are still in existence. The rental market hasn't been solved, social housing hasn't been solved. People are falling in upstream and the pool downstream is getting bigger. People have been feeling guilty until now and bad about the situation, but as the situation doesn't change, they have to deal with that guilt. And one of the ways of dealing with guilt is saying, actually, it's not our fault, it's yours. I still think they think mythically that the private market is going to solve the housing crisis. I think the government needs to start building. I think that's the only solution.
I think we need a massive building programme from government of social housing. I mean, it was done in the past when we were poor. There's nothing to stop us doing the very same thing again, is there?
The only way that we can change it is if we tackle the government to change it. And if the government shift policy or actually have a housing or a social housing policy put in place, till they do, we are accepting homelessness.
And it's one question. Is housing human right? Yes or no?
But surely to Jesus we can do better. Our parents and grandparents all knew better. They may have had way less, but they were more together. Aware of the share, sure they knew whether you were short of sugar or a slice too shy. Minding each other was how we got by. So can't we just reach out and catch those falling through the cracks? Can't our actions say, hey, we've got your backs?